I've long observed that the human psyche never fully abandons its earliest illusions, and among these, none is more powerful than the fantasy of omnipotence. In infancy, the child experiences himself as the absolute center. His cry summons nourishment, his displeasure reorganizes the environment, and the world seems to respond instantly to his needs. When I examine what people now call main character syndrome, I see not a modern invention, but a resurfacing of this primordial condition. Digital platforms simply provide the stage on which this ancient wish can bloom again, dressed in filters and narratives that mimic the infant's belief in being the axis of existence. When I look at individuals who describe themselves as the protagonists of their own cinematic lives, I recognize a psyche attempting to recover that early sense of unlimited significance. This desire is not inherently pathological, rather it reflects the longing to escape the constraints and disappointments that adulthood inevitably imposes. The modern individual, overwhelmed by external demands, grasps at the chance to feel central once more. In this way, the digital world serves as a transitional space where the ego rehearses its old fantasies under the guise of self-expression. Yet, beneath this theatrical display lies an unmistakable regression. The person who insists on being the star of every interaction, every post, every fleeting moment, is not truly celebrating themselves. They are reenacting the infant's conviction that the world is an extension of their will. I recognize the traces of what I once termed primary narcissism, the original state in which the ego has not yet differentiated between itself and the external world. The online stage simply amplifies this confusion, allowing the individual to mistake curated attention for genuine relational significance. As I observe the behaviors associated with this phenomenon, I notice a striking similarity to the early psychic mechanisms that shape a child's first understanding of the world. The craving for dramatic moments, for exaggerated highs and devastating lows, mirrors the extremes of emotional life in infancy, where the child swings between omnipotent joy and catastrophic helplessness. The main character persona is merely an adult's attempt to restore those early emotional intensities while maintaining the illusion of control over them. I also see how this fantasy becomes fragile. When a person depends so heavily on a narrative in which they are central, any disruption, lack of engagement, a moment overshadowed by someone else, or even a neutral interaction, can feel like a collapse of the self. The infant's terror of losing the caregiver's gaze re-emerges here in disguised form. The fear of irrelevance, of fading into the background, of becoming ordinary. The digital world intensifies this vulnerability by offering constant metrics that measure visibility as if measuring worth. The individual therefore clings to the protagonist role not out of vanity, but out of psychological necessity. The self, uncertain of its boundaries, uses exaggerated self-importance to defend against feelings of insignificance. In this sense, the main character behavior is not merely an expression of narcissism, but a defense against the profound anxiety of being unseen. The more fragile the inner self, the more dramatic the outer narrative becomes, as if shouting louder might quiet the internal doubt. It becomes evident to me that this phenomenon flourishes because it offers relief. By believing oneself to be the star of the story, one temporarily escapes the frustrations, humiliations, and compromises that ordinary life demands. The fantasy provides coherence where reality offers chaos. It grants meaning where daily routine feels dull. And yet, this relief is momentary, sustained only as long as the individual can maintain the illusion without interruption from the outside world. The resurgence of this infantile belief is neither accidental nor trivial. It is a testament to the enduring power of early psychic experiences, which linger in the unconscious and seek expression whenever circumstances permit. The digital age has not created narcissism. It has merely provided the perfect environment for old impulses to flourish. To understand the main character syndrome, one must therefore return to the cradle where the first fantasy was born. The fantasy that the world exists to mirror the self. When I examine what you now call the search for validation, I see above all the old drama of the human psyche repeating itself in a new stage. The ego, from its earliest formation, is shaped by the gaze of the primary caregivers. A child discovers itself only when reflected in the eyes of another, when smiled at, mirrored, recognized. In the digital age, this structure has not disappeared. On the contrary, it has been multiplied. Every notification functions like a miniature reflection, telling the individual, you exist because someone has seen you. The ego becomes increasingly dependent on these flashes of acknowledgement to sustain a coherent sense of self. I've long maintained that the individual is not self-sufficient at the level of the ego. It requires an audience to feel real, and this dependence persists into adulthood. What has changed in your contemporary era is the scale. Instead of the few faces that once surrounded a child, now millions of strangers can participate in the construction of one's psychic identity. The person feels enlarged by numbers, by likes, shares, comments, yet simultaneously more fragile, for the loss of this attention threatens a collapse of self-esteem. The ego in this environment becomes a delicate instrument, constantly tuning itself to the reactions it receives. When the subject posts a photo or a thought and awaits reactions, I recognize a familiar pattern. The anxious child looking up to confirm whether the parent approves or disapproves. This dynamic, now transposed into the virtual, forms a cycle of dependence. The pleasure felt from receiving validation resembles what I once described as a narcissistic gain. The individual feels momentarily inflated, powerful, admired. But like any pleasure rooted in external sources, it is fleeting and must be renewed, creating an addictive pattern of self-presentation and reward-seeking. Consider the phenomenon of virality. Many imagine it to be a triumph of creativity or influence, but psychically it represents something far more primitive, a collective mirror in which the individual sees an idealized reflection of themselves. The person becomes radiant under the attention of thousands, just as a child becomes radiant under the delighted gaze of a parent. Yet this radiance is precarious. A single day without engagement, without applause, feels like withdrawal, a sudden drop from omnipotence to insignificance. The ego panics, fearing its own disappearance. I observe, too, that the individual who chases validation begins to construct an identity tailored to please the anonymous audience. Instead of presenting their genuine impulses, they present what they believe will be rewarded. This is no different from the mechanisms that produce symptoms, a compromise between desire and external pressure. The ego sacrifices authenticity in exchange for reassurance. The posts become more dramatic, the expressions more exaggerated, the persona more artificial. The individual ceases to live for themselves and instead becomes a performer in a theater of invisible spectators. And what of criticism or indifference? These act upon the ego like small psychic wounds. A critical comment can destabilize even a seemingly confident individual because it pierces the fragile narcissistic shell constructed through digital interactions. Indifference, no likes, no reactions, can be even more painful, for it mirrors the most ancient fear of all, the fear of not being seen, not being loved, not being significant. In such moments, the ego does not merely feel disappointment, it feels annihilation, anxiety, as though it were dissolving into nothingness. You may wonder why this search for validation appears so intense in modern times. I would answer that the digital world has made what was once a private conflict into a public ritual. The ego is constantly exposed, constantly evaluated, and the more one depends on the gaze of others, the less stable one's inner world becomes. The individual no longer asks, "Do I like who I am?" but rather, "Do they like what I show?" It is a subtle shift with profound psychological consequences. The self becomes fragmented into pieces designed to attract attention rather than integrate into a coherent identity. The pursuit of validation reveals not vanity, but vulnerability. The person who endlessly seeks affirmation is not arrogant, but uncertain. They fear that without the constant echo of approval, they will lose their worth. If I could offer them one insight, it would be this: the ego must learn to draw strength from within, not from the fickle and fleeting gaze of strangers. Until then, the search for validation will continue like an unending hunger, never satisfied, always returning, a symptom of a deeper longing for love that cannot be fulfilled by numbers on a screen. When I observe individuals who curate a digital presence, I see not the authentic self, but a performance, a version of the self that is carefully edited and idealized. The main character of these online personas is not a real person, but a construction, often shaped by the desire to be admired, validated, and adored. Freud would interpret this phenomenon as a reactive formation. A person creates a mask, an image of perfection, to hide their inner feelings of inadequacy, doubt, and vulnerability. The more they present this idealized version, the more distant they become from the true, unfiltered self beneath it. This process begins when the individual feels that their real self is unworthy of love, admiration, or attention. Faced with this perceived inadequacy, the ego instinctively constructs a false identity, one that compensates for the pain of feeling insufficient. In many cases, this new identity does not reflect the person's true desires, fears, or struggles, but is instead a response to societal expectations and the approval they crave. In essence, the self becomes a performance, an act put on for the audience of the world. The very nature of digital platforms amplifies this phenomenon. Social media encourages, even rewards, this performative behavior by giving immediate feedback in the form of likes, comments, and shares. The ego, fragile and dependent on external validation, feeds off this external recognition. However, the more a person depends on these external sources of affirmation, the more fragile and hollow the sense of self becomes. They become a mere reflection of how others see them, losing the ability to distinguish between who they truly are and the mask they've created for public consumption. The performative identity is also deeply connected to narcissism, a term I have used frequently in my psychoanalytic work. Narcissism in this context is not just self-love, but an excessive need for external validation to reinforce the ego. When a person builds their identity around likes and followers, they are, in effect, validating their worth through the eyes of others. The sense of self is no longer internally generated, but rather dictated by the opinions of the digital audience. This dynamic can be dangerously self-perpetuating, as the individual becomes increasingly dependent on external recognition to maintain their fragile self-esteem. In some ways, this performative identity is a form of regression. Just as a child may seek attention or approval from their caregivers to feel validated and loved, the adult who constructs a digital persona is seeking the same type of affirmation, but from a much larger, more anonymous source. The difference, of course, is that the digital world provides instant gratification, but it also creates a distorted mirror. The feedback loop of likes and comments reinforces a version of the self that may be far removed from reality. The person, in this case, does not have the luxury of a genuine organic connection to others, but instead relates to an audience through the lens of their self-crafted performance. The danger in this dynamic is that it leads to a disintegration of the authentic self. The more one invests in the performance, the less connected they become to their true thoughts, feelings, and desires. The mask becomes so convincing that it might eventually feel more real than the person beneath it. Over time, the individual may lose the ability to separate their digital persona from their authentic self, leading to an internal conflict that only deepens their feelings of emptiness and disconnection. This loss of self-awareness is a defense mechanism that has gone too far, a psychological construct that reinforces its own illusion of perfection. What is fascinating is that this performative identity is not just about fame or popularity. It is, at its core, a survival mechanism. The individual has learned to navigate a world that demands more than authenticity. It demands constant self-presentation. In a way, this is a response to the anxiety of modern life, where validation is fleeting and connection feels increasingly superficial. By performing, the individual attempts to overcome the anxiety of being ignored or forgotten, seeking refuge in the adulation of an online world that offers the illusion of permanence. The performative identity is both a mask and a shield. It allows the individual to present an idealized version of themselves to the world, while simultaneously protecting the fragile ego from the discomfort of facing its insecurities. However, this defense is ultimately self-destructive. The more one invests in the performance, the further they drift from the truth of their own existence. They become actors on a stage, playing a role that society has cast for them, and in doing so, they lose the opportunity for genuine self-expression, self-acceptance, and emotional fulfillment. In the digital arena, I observe an invisible rivalry emerging with remarkable intensity. Every individual strives to become the main character of their own carefully crafted narrative. Yet when all attempt to occupy the same symbolic center, they inevitably transform into rivals, even if this rivalry is never spoken aloud. The platform becomes a stage saturated with egos disputing the same spotlight, each one silently measuring themselves against the curated triumphs of the other. This constant exposure to comparison awakens an ancient psychological tension, the fear of insignificance. And so the user projects an idealized image in a desperate effort to remain visible, while the unconscious trembles at the slightest indication of being overshadowed. What appears to be mere digital interaction to my eyes reveals itself as a complex battlefield, where self-worth is negotiated in every post, every reaction, every fleeting moment of attention. Such rivalry intensifies because the metrics of these platforms transform the gaze of the other into something quantifiable, almost measurable, like a scientific pulse of one's value. The subject does not merely wonder what others think. He checks, counts, refreshes, and verifies. This constant surveillance of numbers fosters an ego perpetually threatened, for any decline is experienced as personal diminishment. In earlier eras, social comparison was episodic. Now it is continuous. The unconscious interprets this flood of stimuli as an unending competition for affection, approval, and survival. It is no surprise, therefore, that feelings of envy, inadequacy, and rivalry flourish. Each user becomes both spectator and competitor, locked in a psychological loop where every success of the other feels like a silent blow against one's own fragile sense of centrality. I have long noted that the ego seeks stability through recognitions that confirm its place in the world. Yet in this digital environment, the ego receives contradictory messages. It is invited to shine, but is simultaneously reminded that countless others shine brighter, louder, or more strategically. This duality creates a defensive posture, what I would call a narcissism under siege. The individual amplifies his self-presentation, not out of genuine confidence, but out of fear. He exaggerates, polishes, edits, and performs, believing that only through perfect performance will he remain competitive in the crowded psychic arena. The rivalry thus becomes internalized. The subject battles not only with others, but with an ever-growing ideal of themselves, projected outward in hopes of remaining relevant and adored. This competitive structure, though subtle in appearance, leaves deep psychological traces. When the ego perceives the other as a rival, even unconsciously, it activates defense mechanisms meant to protect its fragile coherence. I see denial emerging in the refusal to acknowledge envy. Rationalization appears in complex justifications for one's constant checking of others. Displacement turns frustration into aggressive comments or passive hostility. Humor masks insecurity beneath irony and sarcasm. These defenses attempt to preserve the ego's dignity in a space where comparison never sleeps. The individual, believing themselves merely scrolling, is in truth navigating an emotional minefield, reacting to every symbol of superiority or inferiority with silent intensity. The rivalry also manifests in imitation, a behavior that, at first glance, appears harmless, but reveals deeper psychic dynamics. When a subject copies another's style, phrases, or persona, it is often driven by an unconscious desire to appropriate the rival's source of success. This imitation is both admiration and aggression. Admiration because the rival possesses something desired, aggression because the ego seeks to strip them of their uniqueness. The digital world, therefore, becomes an endless cycle of borrowed aesthetics, repeated trends, and replicated identities. Beneath this repetition lies a simple truth. The ego fears being left behind, unnoticed, unremarkable, and so it clings to whatever symbol of success appears in its path, even if that means dissolving its individuality in the process. As this rivalry escalates, relationships formed within these spaces become fragile and ambivalent. I observe bonds created under the illusion of camaraderie, yet sustained through subtle competition. Friends monitor each other's successes, collaborators secretly track who receives more engagement. Even strangers become emotional reference points in this silent duel. This relational instability stems from the ego's tendency to oscillate between idealization and devaluation. The rival is admired one moment and dismissed the next. Such oscillations reveal a deeper insecurity, the fear that one's own identity may crumble without constant affirmation. The digital world does not create this insecurity, but it multiplies its intensity, making rivalry the default emotional climate. Within this psychological framework, the pursuit of attention becomes less a desire and more a necessity. The ego interprets visibility as proof of existence and invisibility as annihilation. This is why rivalry persists with such fervor. To lose the spotlight is to feel erased. The digital environment transforms symbolic presence into something nearly tangible, measurable in reactions and impressions. And so, each user fights subtly, incessantly, to maintain their place. This fight is not always conscious. Often it is felt as a vague restlessness, an urge to post, a discomfort when others rise while one remains still. These unconscious impulses echo the earliest conflicts of childhood, the fear of losing the mother's gaze, the terror of being replaced by another. This invisible rivalry exposes the fragility of the modern ego. It reveals a deep dependence on external validation and a persistent fear of obscurity. Yet within this struggle lies an opportunity. By recognizing the unconscious mechanisms at play, the individual may begin to free themselves from the compulsive need to compete. Rivalry thrives in silence. It weakens when brought into awareness. When the subject understands that the digital stage is an illusion, a projection of collective insecurity, the power of comparison begins to lose its grip. What the ego truly seeks is not victory over others, but security within itself. And only through introspection can this security be built, even in a world where everyone is fighting to be the star of their own unfolding narrative. I've long observed that the fear of being forgotten is one of the most primitive anxieties of the human psyche. In the digital world, this fear re-emerges with unprecedented intensity. The subject becomes terrified of not being seen, not being acknowledged, not being validated through the constant gaze of others. When an individual shaped by the main character syndrome vanishes from the feed, even for a short interval, they feel as though they are vanishing from existence itself. This reaction is not rooted in logic, but in the unconscious memory of infancy when love and attention were synonymous with survival. To be unseen was to be at risk, to be forgotten was to be abandoned. Thus, every notification becomes a symbolic confirmation of life, and every moment of silence becomes a small death. The digital environment amplifies this dynamic, transforming visibility into oxygen for the ego and invisibility into existential threat. The architecture of digital platforms intensifies this fear by conditioning the individual to crave constant stimulation. Each like, comment, or share operates as a microdose of affection, a brief assurance that the subject still occupies a valued position in the minds of others. When these signals slow down, the ego begins to panic. I observe this panic in the compulsive need to post, update, share, and reappear, all in an attempt to prevent the imagined catastrophe of being forgotten. The unconscious interprets the algorithmic silence as emotional withdrawal. What the subject experiences is not merely boredom or impatience, but the return of an old terror, the fear that the love once given is now gone, and that the self may no longer hold significance for anyone. The digital world does not create this fear, but it awakens it relentlessly. This anxiety becomes even more potent when the individual compares their own fading engagement to the seemingly constant visibility of others. In my analysis, this comparison mirrors the childhood experience of witnessing affection directed toward another and interpreting it as personal loss. The subject does not simply want to be seen, they want to be seen more, better, and constantly. The rise of others feels threatening, as though their visibility pushes the subject into symbolic darkness. The ego responds defensively, seeking new ways to regain the spotlight. More dramatic posts, more exaggerated self-presentations, more desperate attempts at maintaining relevance. These behaviors reveal not confidence, but a profound dependency on external attention for psychic stability. As the fear of irrelevance grows, the individual becomes trapped in a cycle of self-surveillance. I have observed how the ego begins to monitor itself obsessively, questioning whether it is interesting enough, attractive enough, charismatic enough to retain the interest of an invisible audience. This constant scrutiny breeds anxiety, for the subject must maintain an idealized version of themselves at all times in order to avoid disappearing. When a post fails or engagement declines, the ego experiences this as direct evidence of inadequacy. The digital silence is interpreted as rejection, and rejection becomes proof of diminished worth. Without realizing it, the individual begins to live under the tyranny of imagined observers, whose judgment feels both omnipresent and impossible to satisfy. In this state, the unconscious mobilizes various defense mechanisms to soften the blow of fading attention. I see rationalization appear when the subject convinces themselves that they simply need to post more often. I see denial emerge when they refuse to acknowledge their distress. I observe displacement as frustration directed at unrelated aspects of life. Humor becomes a mask for insecurity, with jokes hiding a deeper fear of being unseen. These defenses momentarily protect the ego, but they do not address the underlying wound. the belief that one's value depends entirely on constant recognition. Until this belief is brought to the surface, the fear of irrelevance remains a powerful and disorienting force. The anxiety of being forgotten also distorts the way the subject relates to time. Moments of rest or absence become intolerable, for they threaten to weaken the fragile bond between self and audience. I have seen how individuals push themselves to maintain near constant presence, fearing that even a single day of silence may erase their place in the digital hierarchy. This relentless pacing mirrors the ancient fear of separation from the parental figure, when absence could feel eternal and catastrophic. The digital subject, without understanding why, reenacts this early trauma each time they refresh their feed or evaluate their relevance. The fear is not of losing followers, it is of losing love. As this fear grows, the individual often begins to confuse being seen with being valued. Visibility becomes a metric of personal worth, and invisibility becomes an emotional wound. I observe the ego struggling under this pressure, for it attempts to derive stability from a source that is inherently unstable. Attention fluctuates, trends shift, and the audience's interest is fickle. To anchor one's identity in such a volatile structure is to live in constant suspense, and so the subject becomes restless, anxious, and desperate for the next opportunity to reaffirm their existence. They cannot tolerate the idea of being forgotten because deep down they fear that without spectators there is no self. Yet even within this turmoil lies the possibility of transformation. When the individual recognizes that the fear of irrelevance is rooted not in the digital world, but in early emotional wounds, they may begin to detach their identity from the gaze of others. The ego can learn to withstand moments of quiet, to rest without fearing disappearance, to exist without the constant demand for validation. The digital world may continue to reward visibility, but the self no longer needs to beg for it. What I have seen again and again is that true stability arises not from being constantly seen, but from understanding oneself deeply. Only then does the terror of being forgotten lose its power, allowing the individual to step out of the spotlight without feeling that they have stepped out of existence. I have observed throughout my work that every illusion, no matter how grand, eventually collides with reality. The individual who sustains the main character fantasy reaches a moment when the script they wrote for themselves can no longer contain the contradictions of real life. This collapse is not merely a disappointment, it is a psychic rupture. The carefully crafted persona begins to crack, exposing the vulnerable, uncertain self beneath it. The subject feels disoriented, for the world no longer behaves according to the narrative they believed they controlled. This moment is frightening, yet profoundly important. It is the first true confrontation between the ego and the demands of reality, a meeting that cannot be indefinitely avoided. When this illusion falls apart, the individual often experiences intense emotional shock. The loss of the protagonist identity can feel like a symbolic death. I have seen subjects cling desperately to the fantasy, insisting that others simply fail to appreciate their uniqueness. But the unconscious knows the truth. The facade is unsustainable. The collapse forces the ego to acknowledge its limits, its imperfections, and its dependency on external validation. This recognition, painful though it may be, marks the beginning of maturity. It shatters omnipotent fantasies and reveals the human condition in its raw form, finite, fallible, and interdependent. In this state of crisis, many individuals experience anger, shame, or confusion. These reactions are natural responses to the dismantling of a defensive structure that once provided comfort. The main character persona functioned as a shield against feelings of inadequacy. Without it, the ego feels exposed. I have witnessed subjects enter temporary withdrawal, avoiding the digital environment where their illusion once flourished. They fear being seen without the mask, as if their reduced visibility confirms their worst anxieties. But what they fail to recognize is that this vulnerability represents an opening, a chance to encounter themselves honestly for the first time. As the illusion dissolves, the individual finally confronts the discrepancy between who they pretend to be and who they actually are. This confrontation is often painful, for it strips away the grandiose projections that once made them feel safe. Yet it is also the very process that allows authentic identity to emerge. The ego begins to understand that true selfhood is not built on exaggerated narratives, nor on external applause, but on the steady integration of one's real experiences, emotions, and limitations. I have always emphasized that the psyche longs for coherence, and it can only achieve this coherence when fantasy aligns with reality rather than fleeing from it. In this moment, defenses that once protected the subject, denial, inflation, idealization, lose their power. Reality insists on being acknowledged, and the ego must reorganize itself in response. This reorganizing process may involve mourning the loss of the idealized self-image. The subject must grieve the fantasy of omnipotence they once embraced. But through this mourning, a deeper transformation becomes possible. The individual gains the capacity to relate to others not as rivals in an imagined drama, but as fellow subjects with their own inner worlds. The collapse of the illusion thus becomes a gateway to empathy, humility, and genuine connection. As introspection deepens, the subject may begin to reinterpret their previous behaviors. What once felt like confidence is now recognized as compensation. What once appeared as superiority is understood as fear. This clarity is not self-punishment, it is liberation. The ego starts to disentangle itself from the constant demand to impress and from the exhausting burden of maintaining a persona. I have seen individuals discover a sense of relief when they stop performing and allow themselves simply to be. In relinquishing the lead role, they discover the freedom of authenticity, something no digital stage can provide. Gradually, the individual constructs a more stable identity, one grounded in internal values rather than fluctuating external judgments. The self becomes less fragile because it no longer depends on audience attention. This newfound stability allows the subject to participate in digital life without being consumed by it. The ego integrates the lesson that visibility does not determine worth, and that relevance does not define existence. In this way, the collapse of the narcissistic illusion becomes the foundation for a more resilient and realistic sense of self. Ultimately, I view this collapse not as failure, but as awakening. When the protagonist fantasy falls apart, the individual has the rare opportunity to rebuild themselves on solid ground. They no longer need to be the center of every story. It becomes enough simply to be present in their own life. This is the moment when the unconscious and the conscious mind align, when the individual accepts the limits of their humanity and discovers strength within those limits. The grandiose narrative fades, but in its place emerges something far more valuable, a self that does not depend on illusion to feel real.